Darling, you got to let me know. Should I stay or should I go? If you say that you are mine, be here till the day I die.
Mick Jones told me that when they first started playing, they weren't even thinking about getting a record contract. I mean, it was just out of the question. They just wanted, as three former art students would feel, they wanted to look fantastic on stage. That was the first thing they wanted to be.
So if you want me off your back, come on and let me know. Should I stay or should I go?
Would you like to interview our manager while he's here?
Catch him while he's hot. Bernie. Bernie.
Leave him.
Sorry, that's Bernie Rose. Sorry about that. Come back.
He invented punk.
Bernie was the most extraordinary man that's ever managed a rock band.
It's obviously too much for him.
Bernie, had a 10-year jump on the guys. He was, 10 years older. But he was very in tune with kind of the counter-cultural movements and the legacy of counter-cultural movements. He would have known about the Paris riots in '68, or Kent State, or the Grosvenor Square riots. And, he was the one that, told the Clash, you've got to write about what you know about, what you understand.
He had a fair point in the early days. I think he actually brought them together. He was a bit of a Malcolm McLaren. They had definitely had a very good relationship, albeit complicated. And I don't quite know what the relationship was between Mick and Bernie, and Joe and Bernie, and Joe and Mick. And it was this sort of triangle.
You had a lot of trouble in Germany.
Yeah, it's fucking horrible. I never want to come back here again. It stinks.
I do though.
Unless we're at war.
It's great. So far. What do you think of the German bird? It's been in hotels and it's been really horrible. A lot of older people have been very sort of like nasty to us. They're not sort of helping us at all. But it's the young people who are great. They're great, like the concert tonight.
They throw us in the fucking slammer. They ain't got a fucking hotel for us. The gigs are fucking useless.
We ain't got a hotel. We got the police came round, dragged us out from the hotel. I mean, we really want to like Germany. Well, I do anyway. I think it looks great.
Mick Jones he lived in loads of different places around London. He's brought up by his gran. And he's a total music head. Like, from the age of 11, he was going to gigs.
His childhood dream was to be a rock star. He had worked hard at his music. He had been in band after band after band. And he was a big fan of people like Mott the Hoople and the Faces, those kind of people's bands that British kids liked in the early 70s.
They got to know Mott the Hoople really well. Mick and all his mates. They used to follow up and down the country, jumping the trains, getting the trains for free, turn up the gigs, blagging their way in, hang out backstage. And that's how he learnt about rock and roll, because Mott the Hoople was very good to the fans, looked after the fans and let them stay in the hotel, which is very much part of the Clash kind of myth.
He had authentic working-class punk credentials.
There just has to be new groups, and then that's what you got.
The band that Bernie had kind of got together or kind of facilitated with Mick and Tony, they had rehearsals underneath a cafe opposite Paddington Station. And Paul Simonon turned up, not as a potential musician, but he was just there with his mate who was trying out on the drums.
What Paul Simonon really was the guy that the Clash were actually singing about. Without him, they may have been a bit of a fake, but Paul Simonon was the real thing.
The school I went to, right? I mean, they're sort of like, all the kids are supposed to sort of like be factory project, you know, that sort of stuff. And like, the school's sort of built, it's a real sort of depressing school and that. And you go there, you don't learn nothing. All you're sort of like working for is just to go into the factory which is around the corner, or something like that. And, well, most of the mates I know are all working in the factory.
Are there a lot of your fans on the dole? I mean, do they feel the same way?
Yeah, else they wouldn't come to our gigs.
Bernie kind of recognised, and Mick to a certain extent, they kind of realised that even though Paul wasn't a musician, he just looked exactly the part of somebody you'd want to have in your band, and they realised he had a kind of particular kind of cool and a particular attitude anyway.
He had this attitude pose thing. You know, he was very much the kind of how you imagine punk to look.
Joe Strummer's background was very different from the rest of the Clash. He wasn't even born in London, he was born in Ankara, but of course he has no Turkish blood in him. His father was a diplomat. So therefore he had this very peripatetic childhood where he would wander through various states, including Iran, and wherever his father was posted.
Yes, he came from a public school background. Yes, his father was an ambassador. But, you know, people have to remember he dropped out and had travelled and had been a folk singer called Woody in Wales and this sort of thing. It wasn't a case of, you know, he suddenly reinvented himself as man of the people. He had rejected his background very wholeheartedly.
If they weren't on the dole, would they be your fans?
Well, I mean, if there was jobs, then they wouldn't be on the dole. Maybe we'd be singing about love and kissing or something.
Joe was on the scene because he was playing with the 101ers, and Mick and Tony James had kind of been to check them out previously, and they kind of recognised in Joe like this sort of really brilliant frontman.
Bernie Rhodes calls up, said, "Are you in or are you out? If you're out, say so now." Strummer, 48 hours? Bernie Rhodes said no. Strummer said, "OK, I'm in."
So Strummer walked in and he knew instantly it was going to work. He just said the chemistry was there. He just said it was absolutely fantastic. It was just like straight away it all fitted, you know, perfect.
Yeah, tell me about White Riot. What's it about?
Notting Gate.
Like, you know that riot they had? Well, we was down there, me and him, and we got searched by policemen looking for bricks, like, and then later on we got searched by Rasta looking for pound notes in our pockets, so...
All we had was bricks and bottles. But still.
But one of the lines in it is everybody does what they're told to.
Yeah, it's true.
Clash was special because of the combination of them. Like Jagger and Richards, you had those people in that band that come together and it collides and it becomes this thing which is bigger than anybody in the band. They just had the vibe of they were the real deal.
Well, they've been down to the Notting Hill Carnival and in '76, in August '76, and they've been the riots there. They were inspired by the fact that the black guys are fighting back, you know, against cops. Cops are pushing around and they make a stand. And at the time, there didn't seem to be a lot of that going on with white people who just sat there taking all the shit. And I think that's what the song was trying to say.
It's often said that the Pistols made you want to smash your head against the wall, but the Clash would give you a reason. And I think that was kind of obvious because everyone was kind of angry and mad, but Strummer would be like, well, OK, we're mad, but what are you going to do about it? They were the ones that I guess gave it its kind of political depth. The Clash kind of took the ball that the Pistols gave them and ran with it. I guess my white mates were coming up with their own soundtrack, something that represented the way they felt. I mean, I had mine, I had reggae music. But every generation needs its own soundtrack.
There was a lot of confusion in the early days about what punk stood for. I mean, punk had lots of kind of right-wing notions or right-wing imagery, and there was this kind of sort of very hard, anarchic, quite extreme ideology that formed in the middle. And when they released White Riot, I mean, people got the wrong end of the stick.
When I first heard White Riot, I'm walking along the street singing this song, all my mates were laughing at me, my black mates. They're like, why are you singing that song, Rasta? They didn't understand what Joe was saying in that song was that the white people, especially the young people, needed to have a right of their own, not against black people, but against the system.
Nothing had ever sounded like that when I heard White Riot. I mean, it sounded like it'd been played at, I don't know, 1,000 miles an hour. You couldn't understand anything at all except whoa, 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 whoa. I didn't know what the hell they were singing about. And then the DJ comes on and goes, that's White Riot by The Clash.
Therefore, White Riot established The Clash's credentials as angry, powerful, and absolutely thrilling. If you never heard this kind of music before, and people in Britain generally hadn't, you'd just think, wow.
They were the hottest property going. They were doing White Riot. It was fantastic. It was full on. The Clash were really exciting. I always thought they were the new Rolling Stones.
The Clash started off as a punk rock group, and they were not really happy when people tried to say a couple of years later that they had transcended punk rock. They wanted to be a punk rock group. They thought being a punk rock group was great. Not being a rock group. They'd like to be a rock and roll group. In fact, punk rock and roll might be more apposite. But they were aware that this was a movement that they were part of.
They were fantastic. There was the Pistols, the Clash, the Damned, the Jam. They were the original four, and everybody else was followers on from that, you know.
They were very proud to consider themselves a punk rock and roll group. I think what had really happened with the Clash was that when they played the Victoria Park Rock Against Racism gig in April '78. That moment, they, and particularly Joe actually, became crystallised as the focus of the positive side of punk. They're not people who, as Susie would, or Sid, would wear swastikas, you know. They wouldn't do that, wouldn't dream of doing that. And they really become, you know, cemented in the mind as, you know, the positive, righteous spirit of punk. They wanted to be a punk group. They wanted to be a punk rock and roll group.
Who wants it to sound like the record? Me neither.
At that time, a studio was very much a kind of there was a glass, and there were musicians on one side and technical people on the other side. And there was obviously, with the punk bands, there was always going to be a mistrust across the glass because of the kind of the way it separated the two halves. So the band wanted someone they knew on the other side of the glass, which was my side of the glass, which is where Mickey came in. And that was basically how the band saw his role, as being a kind of communicator.
For a start, it took punk rock in a new direction. It wasn't a wind-up like the Sex Pistols were. It wasn't good time, pie in the face sloppiness like the Damned were. And it wasn't that sort of leather-jacketed nothingness that the Ramones were. This was it was a statement. It was a manifesto. It was saying, we're the Clash. We are, as the phrase had it, the only band that mattered.
It is the sound of punk. Simply for the fact that the band stated to me very early on, we don't want you to mess with the sound of the band. This is what we sound like, and we want to record it that way.
It was the first proper punk album. It was, I mean, this came, what, a good 6 months before the Pistols released their album. It was probably the first thing where you could go out and what's this punk thing all about? And you could get this album and people put it on. And the most extraordinary thing about it is it's just got these fantastic tunes on it. Like, it hasn't got a bad track on it.
It's a rudimentary, simple, raw record. It's actually quite complex songs. Even White Riot's quite a complex song. It's not just a straight Ramalama run-through. There's little bits in it, and it's cleverly done. There's a cleverness what we're doing here. The production is really, really rudimentary, but that makes it sound better. It's not overproduced. The guitars sound ace. They're just like, they're really cutting and they're really slashing. There's a great energy to it. And the lyrics are great as well. Already you see Strummer's a great lyricist.
If you wanted to know what life was like in 1977 for a young person living in Britain, you play that album 40 minutes or so and you're left in no doubt as to what it was like.
There was no messing about. The band basically played live, you know, in the studio as a setup live. And we overdubbed whatever we needed to overdub. And it was mixed, and that was it, job done. There was no kind of discussion about where we should go. Really, in terms of production terms, it was simply a case of let's capture this band as they are at this moment in time.
To me, the Clash were often as good a reggae band as they were a punk band. They had a natural facility for it. I think really what happened with the Clash is that they just honed into, you know, a really great reggae group. They were a great reggae group.
Oh yeah, scaring the nation with guns and ammunition. Police at the ears and the street. Oh yeah, scaring the nation with guns and ammunition.
First of all, you've got to be honest about kind of white people being inspired by black music, because that goes back to a long tradition, you know, where they align themselves with the only rebel sound around, and invariably that is black music. I mean, you know, what do you think Lennon and McCartney was listening to, or Led Zepp or the Stones, you know? Difference was with the punk and black music is that no longer were they being inspired from sounds from the Mississippi Delta. We were living next door to these people. So the effect was much more direct and obvious. It wasn't disguised in interpretation.
They decided to do a cover of Junior Murvin's Police and Thieves, which was a big kind of reggae kind of club hit at that time. And that was a very interesting and, with retrospect, incredibly important thing that they did. They brought the culture of reggae and rock music together in a really, really kind of cool way.
But they're doing the punk style, so it's kind of reggae, but it's kind of punk, and I think this is really important because it shows there's an escape route for punk. It doesn't always have to be blah 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 fast punk. It's like it's like reaching out to another culture, which is the Rasta culture, which had a similar kind of beef with authoritarian kind of thing, and saying, look, we're with you.
The song that seemingly was just set in Jamaica had a resonance here in the UK. We were all feeling the pressure.
Now, cross-cultural fertilisation, it's part of the cause. But then, it's an extraordinary act of solidarity, of defiance, and of understanding that reggae was great music.
Try watching it, do it right, no one tries to stop it. Oh,
reggae is the dominant theme of their lives. That is really what they listen to most. You know, I mean, it's as simple as that, really, and that's all around them.
One thing about punk bands is they're all great live bands. I mean, every band from the Stranglers to the Buzzcocks, they're all really fantastic live. Of course, the Clash are an amazing live band. There's just the electricity. They have 3 frontmen for a start. I mean, most bands have 1. Simner's doing all these cool shapes at the side. Jones is just like living his rock and roll dream. And Joe Strummer is just so intense. He's exploded on the stage. He's doing that, playing his head out there like that. And it's, when you see clips of it now, it still looks really exciting. Just the passion and the intensity of the performance is amazing.
You were spoiled for choice at any point if you saw him of who to watch. And then the drummers were pretty good as well. I mean, just the whole package.
Whatever stage they took, they rocked. And there was always some controversy going on around the Clash that made them, each of these gigs, kind of an event of some sort or another.
But they were so good, so exciting, and they had so much to say, that very, very soon, after that first album, they transcended punk. They moved, not just punk on, but the Clash moved music on too.
We do the same thing all the time. This is the question. No, because then you're just dead. You know, you do the same thing, and who wants to know? After a while, you know, it makes people sick in the head to do that. So we have to always try new things, you know, and like everyone's a load of sort of like sheep, you know, going, "Nee, it's horrible, nee, it's nice," you know, but they don't fucking know. You know, only we know what we're doing, and like, obviously we think it's for the best. Anyway, we can play it, we can handle it better now, so we don't disguise that, we try and play as good as we can, you know.
The 3 singles they made between the first album coming out and Give 'Em Enough Rope were vitally important. Given the 3 singles, Complete Control, Clash City Rockers and White Man in Hammersmith Palais. The thing with those 3 singles is, at the time when the Sex Pistols were splitting up, where it had all gone horribly wrong, what it did was cement the Clash's position as the punk band. It's the weakest of the 3, but it's still interesting. It's a bit of a mess as a record, but it's interesting in the sense that it had a big rock riff at its core, in the same sort of style as I Can't Explain by The Who.
See there they come down the escalator. Now listen to the G-train accelerator. Then you realise that you gotta have a purpose, but it's gonna knock you out.
It was much more of a heavy metal type record. It had this epic element of trying to do sort of oranges and lemons in the middle, and also this thing that the Clash always did, which was, you know, making a myth of themselves. You know, Clash City Rockers. You know, giving themselves theme tunes, and it was the weakest of the 3, but it was still a big sounding record.
Complete Control was the Clash writing about their favourite subject, which was themselves. The record company who they sold their souls to had forced them to release Remote Control as a single from the first album. They didn't like the idea of this. So therefore, they recorded a song on CBS about CBS releasing a Clash single against their wishes. CBS put it out, they promoted it, they marketed it, and the Clash had their first top 30 hit with it.
Another reggae classic, and a personal favourite of mine, is, of course, White Man in Hammersmith Palais. It's especially dear to me because I actually took Joe to the Hammersmith Palais on the night that he was inspired to write that song. And it was interesting because Joe had gone there expecting to see this kind of roots, ghetto kind of show, not realising that, you know, the people in Jamaica, The ghetto wasn't something that they aspired to. I mean, ghetto, by the very nature of the word, is like get out. It's something that you get out of, not get into. So when Joe saw the show at the Hammersmith Palais, it was a bit kind of Las Vegas, a bit Showtime for him. And he was thrown by this, but he came to understand that that was his own misinterpretation of where the guys were at in Jamaica. You know, people have this kind of romantic view of ghetto life, but there's nothing romantic about it.
This is a start of him really developing as a great lyricist, because he used that idea and he kind of bounced it off into a whole kind of analysis of the punk scene. But while he's kind of exploring all these ideas, he's turning into kind of like a punk Bob Dylan, because nothing he's writing about from that point on is very straightforward.
One of the things I think that makes White Man so special is the way that the Clash were inspired by reggae, but made it their own. There was self-interpretation. So it had the feel, but it wasn't like slavishly copying reggae.
The other very important thing about that record is it's a moment where they take reggae and they take rock music, and it definitely at that point becomes another thing. It becomes, this isn't a cover of a reggae record, it becomes their own kind of Clash sound.
Sandy Pearlman was an American rock producer. He'd produced primarily the Blue Oyster Cult, and he was also, more importantly, almost a staff producer for the Clash's label, CBS.
So they thought, well, if we're going to compromise, let's compromise. The guys made records that we like, so they got him in. And he was a completely different kettle of fish. The second album is overproduced, and it's a lot of people don't like the second album. But I think the second album was quite an underrated record. But I think they didn't like the process of recording it. And Simon hated it, didn't he? Because he had to do these bass lines over and over and over again. So it kind of loses a bit of the spirit of the Clash. You know, it's not as spirited as the first album, but the songs are still really great on the record.
Again, it was just part of their courage in moving stuff forward. That they weren't going to. They weren't going to be dictated to by the punk community what they were or what punk should be. They thought, okay, we're going to do what we want to do.
Mick's experimentation with various things, double tracking guitars, backing vocal ideas, other instruments, the odd piece of piano. And as the recordings developed, more of that happened as Mick became more confident that those elements could be incorporated into the sound of the band. So that by the time you get to the stuff they're recording a year later, you're already hearing different elements and a much more confident attitude to what they want to do in the studio.
He was a man of immense energy and ideas, and you know, a very kind of anarchic energy. He liked winding people up. He liked not paying people to teach them a lesson. You know, he liked kind of throwing a spanner in the works. He liked creating friction among the band. He liked turning them against each other. He was doing all those kind of tricks that he pulled to make the band have this kind of internal kind of frisson there, where they were forever on the point of falling apart. The first album hadn't been released in the States because it was so raw, and then Given Enough Rope, which was tailor-made, whatever anyone says, it was aimed at breaking the American market. and it didn't. It didn't do particularly well.
They had come out with this extraordinary amount of great material very, very quickly. It was just one of those situations where all the punk bands were expected to get back in the studio and make an album as quickly as possible.
Once the band, and particularly Mick, had worked out what he could do in a studio, he was one of the first, he was basically the first member of the band who realised what the studio was capable of. And he more or less assumed the role of kind of master musician come creative force in the studio. He went from owning one guitar to having 6 guitars in the studio, and different amps and different guitars and different ideas. And so the second album was always going to be different to the first.
They were developing faster than their audience. They were always developing faster than their audience. They were developing faster almost for themselves.
Tommy Gun was about army and getting the call up and all this kind of thing. That's a fantastic song, you know. When people say the second album isn't exciting, you just have to put Tommy Gun on, and it's a nice song with Topper's great kind of rat-a-tat drum intro and a machine gun intro and things. Again, really ace dynamics, those different little bits all stuck together. Sometimes you wonder how they managed to remember the whole song with so many little bits in them. But that was Tommy Gun's probably the best, for me, it's probably the best song on the album.
I don't know, I reckon if you got all the people who own the factories and you know the ones who own it and take a large salary with a Rolls Royce, I reckon if you got rid of them somehow, put them in a camp or something, then the factories could go on working and you'd save a lot of money because the workers are doing the work. Right. And the same with the government. I mean, you've got a civil service all set up and everything runs smoothly, and it's the government ministers who make the decisions. But I think if you took them all away, I don't think anybody would hardly notice.
The Clash were very good at interpreting other people's music and making it their own. For example, I Fought the Law being a very good example of that, originally by Bobby Fuller 4. People assume it's a Clash song, in fact, but it's not. They're very good, and it's almost like they were sampling before a sampling machine was invented, because they're just sampling stuff mentally. You know, they're taking stuff from there, stuff from there, stuff from there, and putting it together. That doesn't mean they're just putting it together like a jigsaw. You know, they're putting the inspiration in as well. So it kind of really works. Armageddon Time, which they would record straight after London Calling came out, is a good example of that, because the original by Willie Williams had come out within the last 9 months, maybe even less, before they recorded it. And it's a fantastic tune. Joe and the Clash made it their own. I mean, he does a fantastic interpretation of it. But there's beautiful musical arrangements on their version of it, courtesy of Mick Jones. And later, when they segue it into Magnificent Seven and back again into Armageddon Time, you know, it shows how they're developing original, you know, material by other artists. And it's just, they manage to make it their own. But really, the best material by them is their own.
say, as indeed the album credits say, that Guy Stevens produced London Calling. He didn't. He didn't produce London Calling at all. He was, in effect, the Clash's mascot at the time. Strummer and Jones were so advanced, they were so full of their own talent, that they could very much produce themselves. Now, Guy Stevens, he liked his pills, he liked his drink, and he was an emotionally charged character.
He did loads of crazy stuff, but he really entertained the band. And one of the most important things in the studio to make rock and roll records have a great atmosphere. If you've got a really good vibe, you'll make a great record. With Sandy Pearlman, the vibe was like dead, and they still made a good record, but it's not as good as London's Calling. And he did things like they come in and they set up, and to get warmed up before they played a song, they did Brand New Cadillac. They just did it as a warm-up. And Guy Stevens goes, great, that's it, in the can, one track. And they go, but it speeds up towards the end. And he said, he shouts back, but rock and roll's meant to speed up towards the end. Whereas nowadays, it's like click track, click, 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 everything's the same speed. When you listen to Brand New Cadillac, it sounds really exciting, because the bands naturally play faster towards the end of the song, because you get more and more excited.
If you ask me, he was the perfect man for them, because he was as dangerous and more outrageous than they were, but he also was grounded in a knowledge of real music and roots of music. And I would imagine Guy was a very strong influence, albeit if it was only on Mick, who then took on the mantle of being the producer when Guy left. But I think, for me, I think there's a strong influence of Guy Stevens on that album, in as much as he brought them to the point where they recognised that whatever went before the Clash was of some worth, and that they could learn from that. And he obviously knew how to lay down the basic tracks and get that Spectre sound that is there on some of them. I'm sure that was Guy, you know.
I don't reckon there's any track on it that remotely resembles 1977 punk.
They were the first ones to break free of that kind, you know, the shackles that punk had become, you know, thinking that it had to be about loud, fast guitars. I mean, you can be silent and deadly too. So, but it's interesting, if you look at the first album, the difference between the first album and London Calling, they seem miles apart. But if you understand where they're coming from, there is a continuity, and the Clash weren't afraid to grow.
They were still interested in their rebel myths, exactly the same as they had been on Give 'Em Enough Rope. But what they seem to have learnt to do on London Calling is to find other people to put those myths through.
It's that, wow, this is, you know, to be reckoned with. This was good stuff. And that was, it was unfinished then. I mean, it didn't have any horns on it, didn't have the finished vocals on it. But you tell by the grooves that they'd actually turned some corner, or, you know, something had happened, definitely, because I'd listened. They'd given them enough rope to listen to. I couldn't listen to it. I couldn't hear anything. It was just like, you know, coming at me. Great energy, etc. But musically, I couldn't discern anything. Whereas I went up to do this album, and everything was clear and everything was grounded in real music. I was impressed.
London Calling, when the Clash went out on the 16 Tons tour, which began really in January 1980 and was the tour to promote the album, revealed that they could handle these tunes and their complexity and their musical wit, and with absolute dexterity. The material helped them become the powerhouse on stage, you know, that they became by the time that they played in Bonds in New York, for example, 18 months later. It helped the depth and width of this material really helped the Clash's live set, because there's a lot of songs for a start.
good job. But where they were last night, no one can remember. Somebody got murdered by the keys forever.
Sandinista again saw the clash, as they had before, but this time they were going into all these different musical areas with almost no regard for a theme running through Sandinista. In fact, the only real theme is the title, which of course is taken from the Nicaraguan freedom fighters who were trying to overthrow, and eventually did overthrow, the Somoza dictatorship there.
It educated an entire generation about things like the freedom fighters in Nicaragua and the harm that America was doing in Latin America.
Joe had this idea that, you know, music was like a global radio station, and he really maximised that. And, you know, you can see that in his lyrics. I mean, sometimes Joe's got more ideas in a couple of rhyming couplets than some people have in their whole album.
Big one, yeah. I think they've really got one absolutely fantastic album there, but they released like 4. You know, it was a ridiculous amount of stuff to actually take in. But if you condense that down, I think we would have had another sort of London Calling on their hands, personally.
Sandinista was ahead of its time, there's no doubt about that. I mean, it's a dub album, it's a jazz album, it's a soul album, it's a calypso album, it's got spoken word bits on it, it's got silly bits on it, it's massively long. It's a record that I think people today kind of understand better than they did at the time.
There's so much great music on there, and some of the kind of rock reggae stuff they play there is fantastic. You know, they've really got that reggae thing down off pat now. Sometimes on a sunny day you put that record on, and now it's on CD, it makes a lot more sense. You just leave it on for the whole extent of it. It really does work, you know. Yeah, there's some tracks that aren't so great, but I'd say the bulk of it's really good stuff.
I think if you listen to the Sandinista tracks now, you listen to something like Somebody Got Murdered, or Police on My Back, and you can hear that they're that far from being absolutely brilliant records, and yet they're just not, because they sound muffled and messy, and you can't really hear what's going on.
We're about to present a song off their current triple record album, which is called Sandinista. It's called The Magnificent Seven. Would you please join me in welcoming to our show, The Clash. Here they are.
Don't you ever stop, how long I like to stop, get your car out of that gear. Don't you ever stop, how long I like to stop, get your car out of that gear.
I was doing more and more work with them. Went over to New York, and I took Norman Watroy, the bass player from the Blockheads over there, to add the funk. So Norman and I went down to the studio very early in the morning. I remember it was pouring with rain, lightning, all sorts of things. It was really lashing down. We got the studio, there's no one there, so we sort of stripped off what we could, put our socks on the radiators and things, started to dry off, have a cup of tea. The engineer came in, you know, lit up the machines, and Norman and I went in the studio and just started jamming, you know, with the piano and bass. We just got set up, and the engineer was taking sounds. The Clash came in the middle of it, and said, what's this? And we said, oh, just jamming. So next thing we know, they'd sent out for another 16 or 32 track machine, wherever they were working on. There were loads more reels, and they copied what we'd done to that reel, and then they cut the two things up into sort of verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. Joe went out and wrote a lyric, and that was Magnificent Seven.
Hey, it's 7 a.m. Move yourself to go again. Cold water in the face brings you back to the sharp old place. Like old nuts and your bankers too. Must get up and learn those rules. With a man, a crazy kid. Once is sun and once is deep. AM, the FM, the PM too. Turning out that boogaloo. Gets you up, I get you out. But how long can you keep it up? Give me 100, give me Sony. We're phony, I'm gonna die. Indian sense, English pounds and Eskimo pants. You love! Don't stop, give it all you got. You love! Don't stop, give it all you got.
There's another one called Lightning Strikes, which was a jam, and it was about the day, because as we came to the studio, it was lightning, it was rain, there was, you know, so it was an on-the-spot sort of thing, yeah. So there was a lot of creativity went down from the Blockheads end, I think.
For you. The fire marshal say last night Bonds was crowded beyond its legal capacity. So if you want to see the Clash tonight for the midnight performance, you have to have Ticketron tickets, or they won't let you in the front door.
Tickets to their week-long stint in Manhattan, oversold by Bonds Casino. Peter Bannon is standing by live now in Times Square, where fans are lining up for tonight's show.
The Clash sold 3,500 tickets each for a week of shows. Last night, although there was no problem, fire marshals determined 1,800 was a safe capacity based on the number of fire exits. The Clash decided to honor Ticketron tickets sold nationwide for the night on the ticket. For the rest, they have rescheduled another show for each overbooked night, or given the folks the option of a refund.
That news crackled around America and made people understand, well, I've never heard of this Clash lot, but you know, normal rock bands don't get their fans fighting in the street because they couldn't get into the gig, you know, and they certainly don't bring New York, you know, the scene, done everything town to a standstill.
It was the moment they took New York. They had on Sandinista, they had Magnificent Seven, which is essentially a rap record. It's probably the first British rap record.
The hip-hop thing's starting to take off, and that had a big effect on the Clash, especially Mick Jones, because all of a sudden they're writing things like Mag 7 and Lightning Strikes, and then some of the black radio stations are picking up on these tracks and playing them on the radio stations. So that was a buzz for them to kind of embrace hip-hop and make it part of their repertoire.
The Clash picked a dozen other groups to appear with them as opening acts in the hopes of opening ears to different music. Last night it was the New York rapper stars, the disco DJs who have turned their platter chatter into an art form.
Okay. Let me ask you about the Bonds concerts.
We're in the middle of them.
Okay. What happened down there? Do you know what happened so that a lot of people had to wait to get in and the place supposedly was oversold? What did happen to the best of your knowledge there?
Well, as far as I think every club in New York jams in as many people as possible, well, anywhere in the world. And the fire department, sometimes they come down, sometimes they don't, you know? And they happen to come down. I mean, we kind of walked into the situation blind. You know, we've just been touring Europe, and we come straight here from Europe without a break. And we just thought, well, we got we sold out 7 nights in this nightclub called Bonds, and a stand-up venue. Everything is cushty-mushty. But then we arrived, and the fire department, the building department, they're all shutting the place down faster than we can open it, you know. But it's all right now, because we're here for the duration.
I understand that, but many groups would say, look, we're going to play the 7 performances, and then no matter what happened, no matter how many people have to stand and wait, we're going to go home.
Right, let's go.
Oh, no. you men did not do that.
We don't want to poo-poo on the fans. You know, it's very important that, seeing as they've bought tickets, right, we feel it's our responsibility to honour it.
Can I ask what you're putting on me?
It's a nice cash bench.
Oh, okay. You've been described, or I think one of you has said you're a group that's unmanageable. Do you really feel that way about yourselves, that you're maybe unmanageable in the sense of being, forgive me, out of control?
We have a manager. We have a manager.
How's he doing?
We've had him before as well. We've had him before.
And then he went away for a while and came back, huh?
He went to the funny farm.
Oh.
Where life is beautiful all the time.
Nice and happy. Fairport Lounge.
Bernie Rhodes was reinstated shortly after Sandinista was completed, but shortly before it was released.
He kind of comes in at the tail end and tries to revamp the whole situation, but it's probably too late by then with those ideas. The scene's moved, the scene's changed. There was a moment of time, which the punk thing, you cannot get back to that time again. And his relationship with band members isn't so good either, so it does speed up the band dissolving completely.
It was the beginning of the end, because I think it was the first major decision in the Clash's career, which Mick was kind of overruled on, and he very much didn't want Bernard back, and Joe and Paul did, and you can look back and you can see this was the beginning of the parting of ways.
I don't think everybody wanted to get back with Bernie. I think Joe did. Maybe he'd lost his way somewhere and was trying to, you know, find his footing again by going back with Bernie. But it didn't work with me and Bernie.
Strummer and Simon have a little swing back to the punk rock thing here. They want to get the band to be a bit more punk rock, street, get back to our roots kind of thing. I think Mick Jones is living in a different kind of world now.
There just seemed to be a widening rift. There was Strummer and Simon in one camp, there was Mick Jones in another camp, and then there was Topper Headon, who was so strung out by this time on heroin that he really wasn't any use to either camp.
At the start of 1982, the Clash toured the Far East for the first time, and they played Japan. They're loved in Japan. They play Australia, and Australia's been waiting to see them for, you know, since 1977. So they're breaking into new territory. They're kind of going global, but at the same time, there's a fundamental problem in the band, and that's Topper's heroin habit.
It's very difficult to work with someone who's on heroin. I mean, get them in and out of countries is difficult enough. You know, if they're carrying stuff on them, everyone's going to get in trouble. You know. He's not being, his drumming was getting hard. He couldn't get through whole sets. It was difficult for him. Because they Clash used to play like 2.5 hours, like really massive, long sets. If you're a heroin addict, that's hard work.
It did embarrass them, Topper becoming a heroin addict, because that kind of rock decadence was everything they stood against. Producer after producer that worked with the Clash sort of have a stunned amazement about Topper Headon, and it's not just he was the best drummer. He was probably better at all the other instruments than everybody else as well. He was a natural musician. It was not attitude with him or playing in a particular, you know, a particularly recognisable style. He was an all-round jazz-trained musician who could play anything at any tempo, you know, in any style.
Topper at the time, Topper Headon, was just he was an astounding, you know, talent, and I loved playing with him as a drummer. Fabulous, you know, and these days he's sort of given it all up, which is a shame.
I believe that they wanted him to come back, and that they thought if he was off the road, that if he was out the way of temptation, if he was in some sort of rehab, if he got himself sorted out, then he could return, because he was the drummer of the Clash in a way that no one else was.
The Clash would be the first to admit, and it's kind of obvious, that in their attempts to do the right thing, sometimes some of the things came off a little heavy-handed. But, you know, you don't get it right all the time, and I kind of dug the fact that they weren't afraid to make mistakes. You know, it's better than being a wimp and not trying to do anything. You know, and I think there were a few almost embarrassing moments in their career. But to me, it all added to part of the whole. You know, you don't need to be perfect to do something good.
If you could play on the fiddle, how's about a British chick and Rio? Speaking King's English in quotation, as Dalehead towns feel the steel mills rust.
It doesn't actually sound much like the Clash, does it, when you hear it? But it's got like, well, it's interesting because they've gone off somewhere else. It's quite different from Sandinista. They swerved off. There's a lot of New York in that record. You can hear a lot of the electro stuff soaking in there. But there's some great songs on there.
This is your paradise.
They were now a band whose sound sounded like quite a lot of other standard rock bands. They'd lost that unique sense of morality, of power, and of seeing the musical world as broadly as they could.
What happened was, like, Mick's musical vision departed from Joe and Paul's. Mick produced and mixed a version of the album which was essentially another double album. But it was decided that by the record company and basically the other guys in the band that they couldn't put out a double, and they brought in somebody, Glyn Johns, to chop it down to a single, very much against Mick's wishes. So you have another episode in the story where Mick is being kind of overruled by the other guys in the band, even though in some senses Mick was the driving force behind the music in that band, and thus you start to see the beginning of the end.
The demise of the Clash, you know, I've got a different take on it. I mean, it was never about longevity. It was about, you know, having a window of opportunity and what you did with that window of opportunity, making the most of the space that you had, you know. And, you know, most of the cool bands that I'm into, if you check out their career, it's usually about a 7 or 8 year span. And it occurred to me that maybe, you know, to grow as individuals, you have to break out of that kind of gang thing. You know, to the point of where I'm almost suspicious of people that are together for longer than 7 or 8 years. Longevity was never the point. And, you know, people cite, you know, musical differences, Mick becoming a problem. Me, I don't know, I don't even care. I mean, for my money, you know, the longer bands are around, all they do is end up destroying their own myth anyway.
Darling, you got to let me know. Should I stay or should I go? If you say that you are mine, be here till the day I die. Come on and let me know. Should I stay?
All the time that they were making great music together, when they got in a room, they could forgive each other anything, you know, because the end justified the mean. But then you got to a point in the summer of 1983 where they really didn't like the music that Mick was presenting to them. Mick had got fed up with Bernie. Bernie had offered them management contracts that they wanted to sign. Paul and Joe signed theirs. Mick didn't. He wanted to run it past his lawyer. All those divisions in the band came to a head because they weren't making great music anymore.
Clash is often perceived as finishing when Mick Jones was kicked out. Now, of course, this is factually correct because there was another album. But what was lost was this notion of the Clash.
Should I cool it or should I blow?
Without Mick Jones, there wasn't a Clash. There's absolutely no way you could have thrown out Mick Jones, Joe Strummer or Paul Simon and had the Clash.
When they recorded the album with Bernard as the producer, that Cut the Crap in Munich, I mean, it's quite clearly all that musicality and genius that Mick brought to the Clash was gone. I mean, Joe was still writing pretty good lyrics, but that was all that was left. There was everything that was good about the Clash had just sort of been poured down the drain.
That belief that you can write a very, very basic rock song and just kind of shove a beatbox over the top of it, and some synths maybe, and that somehow it's like hip-hop or it's like electro. If you ever want proof that that's not the case, then listen to Cut the Crap, because, you know, there's not a danceable moment on it. It's just a mess. The reviews, I mean, obviously the chart position did pretty poorly, but the reviews were savage, and obviously I think it was a strange moment of realisation for Joe Strummer, that he realised that he'd gone along with this idea of calling the album Cut the Crap, and that this was a gift to every critic of the band. They'd cut a piece of crap, you know, and I think that was kind of the last straw when it suddenly kind of hit him, you know, as every reviewer lined up to use the cut the crap pun, that of just what a monumental folly it had all been, and he just called a band meeting and essentially, you know, gave the other three their cards.
What is your motivation, as I said again in introducing you, for selling records at discount prices or lower prices?
Same as the
same
tickets.
reason, but where do you get this motivation? Because a lot of groups, all they come into the business for is to make a lot of money and to hell with the...
Yeah, but we used to be them.
Right, and so, like, we haven't forgotten what it's like. All the other groups have forgotten what it was like.
Because they're all too
we know
busy.
that one day we will return and become nothing again, you know?
I mean, the reason the Clash was so great was for 4 reasons. Tupper Headon, Paul Simon and Mick Jones and Joe Strummer. That's it, man. Simple as that. It was the dynamics, the chemistry between those 4 guys that made the Clash what they were. You know, and that, combined with motivation, determination and passion, you couldn't fuck with them.
Tonight in the grove.
After the demise of the Clash Mark II, I think Joe was treading water for a bit, but then when he discovered some like-minded people that would become the Mescaleros, things were really looking up for him. I mean, I was lucky enough to film the last show at the Brixton Academy, and it was fantastic. I mean, there was the passion there that had always been there, and he was no longer relying on the Clash's back catalogue. I mean, he slipped a few of those numbers in, but, you know, Joe Strummer, you know, hard man to kind of beat.
All right, you lot, what made you come on this programme as opposed to any other that you've not been on so far?
You can just plug in and play like you do on a gig, you know? It's no miming, you just plug in and play, you know?
You know, first we'd go to hit you right on the middle of the head with it.
Yeah, we'd be 100
times, right? But now we like to just... a few strokes of the hammer here and there, you know? It's more powerful than...
The Clash's body of work just stands up. I mean, the funniest thing about it is, like, 85% of it isn't punk rock. It's this weird kind of world reggae, dub, Clash kind of music. It's not even really rock music, a lot of it, but it's proved hugely influential. People saw that the Clash were light years ahead of their time in getting into reggae and rap and kind of almost like soundtracky music. And I reckon those records just sound brilliant today. And the later ones that were kind of dismissed by people at the time, just they make a hell of a lot of sense now.
The next generation will be from Genesis to Revelation.
They changed the face of music. They made it acceptable for white and black to combine. And that sounds a bit woolly and naive, but it's not. Not when you hear it, and not when it's taken for granted today. They moved white music out of the white ghetto. They were also the most exciting rock and roll band. They understood the duty of a rock band more than anything is to be thrilling. And the Clash were consistently thrilling. And that's an extraordinary legacy. Also, the body of music that they left behind. For the most part, of course it's not perfect. You know, anyone who's heard Mensforth Hill knows that the Clash were not always great. In fact, sometimes they were rubbish. But, for the most part, this legacy is extraordinary. And it still rings loud, clear, true and inspirational today.
I think the Clash's legacy is really that they happened in spite of the business and not because of the business. You know, the whole DIY thing, the whole thing about a good idea attempted is better than a bad idea perfected. You know, making your problems your assets. You know, the Clash were the embodiment of all these ideas.
I think every group labours under the shadow of the Clash in exactly the same way as they still labour under the shadow of the Beatles. Every group has to live up to this band's commitment on some level or another. If they don't, you might not be able to question their music or their money-making ability, but you question their commitment and their integrity, and you can question them correctly because the Clash proved that you can do this and you can do this properly.
Rock and roll, it's a love, we're gonna start war. It's a love,